Hello, Night Seekers, and welcome to Lacuna Noir. This is where forgotten stories and gentle voices meet, carrying you softly into peaceful sleep, wrapped in mystery. Before tonight's stories begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And a little note before we begin. You may notice a few brief ads in the first 10 minutes, but after that, the rest of the video is completely ad-free. Just you, the silence, and the stories. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the night carry you. If you're drawn to these quiet, shadowed nights, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story when darkness calls. My dad's friend went through something that most people would struggle to even imagine, let alone live through. It all began on what seemed like a completely normal day. There was nothing special about it, nothing that would make anyone pause and think something could go wrong. His wife had gone out in the same way she always did. She was just taking the dogs for a walk. It was part of her daily routine, something so familiar that it had become almost automatic. The kind of thing you do without overthinking, because you feel safe doing it. The neighborhood was known to them. The path was known. The timing was normal. Everything about it was ordinary in the most peaceful way. That is what makes what happened later so hard to understand. There was a man who had recently been released from a mental hospital. On that same day, for reasons no one could ever fully explain in a way that makes sense, he crossed paths with her. There was no connection between them. They were strangers. They had no history, no interaction before that moment. Nothing that would suggest their lives were about to intersect in such a tragic way. And then, in a sudden and shocking moment, he attacked her in the street. It happened so quickly that there was no time for anyone nearby to process it, no time for warning or prevention. It was not something that built up over time or showed signs in advance. It was random in the most disturbing way. An ordinary walk turned into something unthinkable in a matter of moments. She never made it back home. At the time, my dad's friend had no idea what had happened outside. He was at home, waiting for her like he always did. There was nothing unusual about that evening. In his mind, she had simply gone out for her usual walk with the dogs. She had done it many times before. It was part of their shared routine, something so normal that it never raised any concern. He probably went about small things at home, maybe checking his phone, maybe doing simple chores, maybe just sitting and waiting for her return. There was no alarm in his mind, no feeling that something was wrong. Time was passing in the way it normally does when you are not worried. But slowly, that normal feeling began to shift. She was taking longer than expected. At first, it was easy to ignore. Delays happened. Maybe she stopped to talk to someone. Maybe the dogs were slow. Maybe she took a slightly different route. These are the kinds of thoughts people use to calm themselves when there is no reason yet to panic. But as more time passed, the uncertainty started to grow in a quiet way. It was not sudden fear. It was something softer at first. A small question in the back of the mind, then another. Then a feeling that something just did not feel right. He likely checked again, waiting a bit longer, hoping she would walk through the door at any moment. But she did not. Eventually, the concern became strong enough that he decided to go out and look for her. He chose the same route she usually took with the dogs. It was familiar to him, too, not just to her. That familiarity probably gave him some comfort at first. There was no reason to think anything strange would be happening there. It was just a normal walk through a normal neighborhood. a path they had both seen countless times before. As he walked, he probably expected to see her any moment. Maybe she had just paused somewhere. Maybe she was a little further ahead. Maybe she had simply lost track of time. These are the kinds of thoughts that keep the mind calm when you are unsure but not yet afraid. But then something began to break that sense of normality. In the distance, he noticed flashing blue lights, police vehicles. That kind of sight changes the feeling of a place instantly. Even if you do not yet know what is happening, your mind starts to shift. Something is wrong, but you do not yet know if it is connected to you or not. Most people, in that moment, instinctively try to separate themselves from it. They think it must be something unrelated, an accident somewhere else, a situation involving strangers. He likely slowed down without even realizing it, trying to understand what was happening ahead. The closer he got, the more serious the scene became. There were officers blocking part of the area. There was activity, movement, tension in the air that you can feel even without hearing anything clearly. But still, he did not yet know. There was no clear answer, just distance, confusion, and a growing sense of unease. Then a police officer stopped him. He was not allowed to go further. That moment is often where reality begins to shift, even before it is fully explained. When you are told to stop, when you are kept back from something, your mind starts filling in the blanks on its own. But even then, he probably still had hope that it was nothing connected to him personally. It is a strange thing the human mind does. It protects you from the worst answer for as long as possible. He was told there had been an incident. Nothing more at first, just that the area was restricted. Those words alone are heavy, but still vague enough that your mind can resist the truth. He was still standing in that uncertain space between not knowing and not wanting to know. And then came the moment that ended all uncertainty. He saw her. In that instant, everything changed at once. There was no gradual understanding, no slow realization that he could prepare himself for. It all collapsed into a single moment. The waiting, the confusion, the walk down a familiar path, the expectation of seeing her soon at home, all of it ended in a way that his mind could not have prepared for. What he saw made the situation real in the most devastating way. People often say that shock feels like time slowing down. That is probably the closest way to describe what he experienced. Everything around him likely became distant and unclear, as if the world had suddenly moved too far away to feel normal anymore. The police, the lights, the blocked road, the noise, the movement, all of it became secondary. The only thing that mattered in that moment was the realization that his wife, who had left home for something so ordinary, was not coming back. And just like that, the normal evening he had expected was gone forever. What makes stories like this so difficult for people to process is not only what happened, but how ordinary everything was before it happened. There was no warning sign that anyone in that moment would have recognized. There was no build-up that made it feel predictable. It was a normal routine day, the kind that millions of people live without a second thought. A walk with dogs, a familiar street, a safe feeling built from repetition. And yet, something unpredictable entered that space and changed everything in an instant. For my dad's friend, life did not change slowly after that moment. It did not ease into a new reality over time. It shifted immediately, completely, and permanently in a single experience he could never undo or forget. Afterward, even for people who hear about it secondhand, there is often a quiet that follows. Not because there is anything to say that can fix it, but because it forces a certain awareness. It reminds you that life is built on routines that feel safe, until something proves otherwise without warning. Most people try not to think about that too deeply, because it is uncomfortable. It makes the ordinary feel fragile. It makes everyday moments feel more significant than they appear on the surface. But for him, there is no way to separate the memory from reality. A simple walk, something so normal and repeated, became the moment that changed everything. And what remains is not just grief, but the awareness that life can shift in ways no one can prepare for, no matter how careful or routine everything seems. When I was a kid, we lived out in the countryside on a large piece of land where everything felt wide open and quiet. Our house wasn't close to anything else, and the nearest neighbors were far enough away that at night, it almost felt like we were completely alone out there. The roads around us were long, mostly empty, and surrounded by fields and dark stretches of trees. It was the kind of place where you got used to silence, and when something broke that silence, it immediately stood out. One evening, we were coming back home later than usual. I remember it was already dark when we turned onto our road. The headlights cut through the night, lighting up the narrow driveway that led toward our house. Everything felt normal at first, the way it always did when we returned home after being out. Tired, quiet, just looking forward to getting inside. But as we slowed down and got closer, something unusual caught our attention. Down the road, near the ditch that ran along the edge of our property, there was a car pulled over. At first glance, it didn't seem like anything alarming. Out in rural areas like ours, seeing a car stopped on the side of the road wasn't exactly strange. People had flat tires, engines overheated, or sometimes just stopped to check directions. It didn't immediately stand out as anything serious. But as we drove a little closer, we started noticing movement. There were two people outside the car. One of them looked like they were climbing up from the ditch, pulling themselves back onto the road. The other was standing nearby. From where we were, it looked like they might have been dealing with some kind of trouble. Maybe a minor accident or the car slipping off the road. It was dark and details weren't clear, just shapes and motion under the dim light. We all naturally looked a bit longer than usual. Something about the scene made us slow down even more, trying to understand what we were seeing. It wasn't clearly dangerous, but it also didn't feel completely normal either. It was just enough to make you curious and slightly uneasy at the same time. When we finally reached our driveway and pulled into the yard, my mom immediately spoke up. She said my dad should go back and check if those people were okay. That was just the kind of person she was. If someone might be in trouble nearby, she would want to help without thinking twice. For a moment, it seemed like that would be the natural thing to do. It was close. We were already home. And from what we had seen, it looked like people who might need assistance. But my dad didn't move right away. He stayed quiet for a few seconds, still looking out toward the road. Then he said something didn't feel right. He explained that from what he had seen, the people didn't look injured or desperate. There was no obvious sign of panic or distress. And more than anything, it was late, it was dark, and we were already safe at home. He didn't say it in a dramatic way. It was calm, but firm. Just a feeling he couldn't explain properly, but enough to make him hesitate. After a short moment of thinking it over, he made the decision not to go back. At the time, it didn't feel like a big moment. There was no sense that something important had just happened. We simply went inside the house, locked the doors, and carried on with the night like normal. We ate, talked a little, and eventually went to bed. It felt like just another ordinary evening in a quiet place where nothing usually happened. There was no reason to think that scene on the road would matter again. But the next morning changed everything. We were suddenly woken up by loud knocking at the door. It wasn't the kind of knock you ignore or roll over from in bed. It was sharp and urgent. When my dad went to open the door, there were police officers standing outside. Even before anyone said anything, the atmosphere felt completely different. There was a seriousness in the way they stood, the way they looked around, the way they spoke. Something had clearly happened. Before we could even fully process what was going on, we started noticing activity outside. Our yard, and parts of the surrounding area were being marked off with police tape. Bright lines of yellow stretched across places that were normally just open space and grass. It made everything feel strange, like our home had suddenly become part of something unfamiliar and serious. The officers began asking questions and explaining why they were there. As they spoke, the situation slowly started to unfold in a way that was hard to take in at first. Some horseback riders had passed through the area early that morning. They were riding along the same stretch of road near our property when they came across something disturbing in the ditch. What they found made them immediately call the authorities. There, in the ditch not far from where we had seen that car the night before, they discovered a black plastic bag. Inside it, something was partially visible. A human leg. Those words hit in a way that is hard to describe. It didn't feel real at first, almost like something you hear in a story rather than something happening right outside your home. But the police were already treating the area as a serious crime scene. More officers arrived, more tape went up, and the whole space around us turned into an active investigation site. In that moment, everything from the night before suddenly came back with a completely different meaning. The car on the side of the road, the two people outside it, the quiet hesitation, the decision not to stop, all of it was now connected to something far darker than anything we could have imagined in that moment. What had looked like a simple roadside situation, maybe a broken-down vehicle, I was now part of something deeply disturbing. I still remember my mom's reaction as the police continued explaining. At first, she just stood there in shock, trying to understand what she was hearing. But then something shifted in her expression. It wasn't just fear or disbelief. It was realization, the kind that slowly sinks in when you understand how close something came to being very different. She looked toward my dad, and I think in that moment we all understood the same thing without needing to say it out loud. If he had gone down that road the night before, if he had walked over to that car, things could have taken a completely different turn. That thought alone was enough to make the whole situation feel heavier than anything else. It wasn't just about what had happened. It was about what could have happened. The police didn't share every detail with us, and even what little we heard was enough. The investigation was still ongoing, and the area remained closed off for a while after that. But the basic truth was already clear. Something violent had taken place near where we had been just hours earlier, and we had unknowingly been right next to it, without realizing what was going on. After the police left and things slowly started to settle, the house felt different. Not physically, but emotionally. It was quieter in a different way. The kind of quiet that comes after you've learned something you can't unlearn. For a long time after that, I kept thinking about how ordinary everything had looked the night before. There was no obvious warning, no clear sign that something dangerous was happening, no shouting, no visible struggle, and nothing that would immediately make you stop and say something is wrong here. Just a car on the side of a rural road and two people outside it. That's what makes it stay with me even now. How normal it all appeared in the moment. How easily your mind can fill in harmless explanations for things that might not be harmless at all. You assume a breakdown, a small accident, a quick stop. You don't immediately think of anything darker because there's nothing forcing you to. And yet, behind that ordinary scene, something terrible had already happened. As time passed, I came to understand something important from that night. It wasn't just about danger or coincidence. It was about how quickly situations can hide their true nature, and how often you are forced to rely on instinct when you don't have full information. My dad's decision that night wasn't based on certainty. It was based on a feeling. A quiet hesitation that didn't fully make sense at the time, but turned out to matter in a way none of us could have predicted. Looking back now, it still feels strange to think about. How close it all was. How easily things could have gone in a different direction without anyone realizing it until it was too late. There's a kind of weight that comes with that realization, something that stays with you even years later. It also changed the way I see moments like that in general. Small, ordinary scenes on the surface, but not always as simple as they appear. It reminds you that sometimes the most important decisions are the ones you make in seconds, without knowing the full picture and without ever finding out what you avoided until much later. Even now, when I think back to that night on the quiet rural road, I don't just remember what we saw. I remember what we didn't see, and how easily everything could have turned out differently without us ever realizing how close we came to it. There are some stories you hear once, and then they just stay in your mind in a strange way, not because they are loud or dramatic in a traditional sense, but because they make everyday life feel slightly different afterward. A coworker once shared a story like that with me, and even though it sounded almost unbelievable at first, it was the kind of thing that starts to feel more real the longer you think about it. He said there have been confirmed cases in different countries where people were secretly living inside someone else's home without the owner knowing. Not for a night or two, but for weeks, months, and in at least one case that people often talk about, even years. At first, it sounds like something out of a movie. The idea that someone could be inside your house, sharing your space, moving around when you are not there, and then hiding just in time before you come back. It feels too extreme to be true. But these cases have been documented, and the details of them are exactly what makes them so disturbing. In the case my co-worker mentioned, it reportedly went on for a very long time. The homeowner had no idea at all that someone else was living in the same space. Everything seemed normal on the surface. There were no obvious signs, no broken doors, no dramatic clues that would immediately point to anything wrong. Life just continued as usual. The intruder, according to the story, was careful. They didn't behave in a way that would create a tension. Instead of doing anything loud or noticeable, they stayed hidden and moved only when it felt safe. The pattern was simple and calculated. They would wait until the homeowner left for work, and only then would they come out of hiding. During those hours alone, they would take very small amounts of food. Nothing that would create a sudden, obvious shortage. Just enough to survive without raising suspicion. It wasn't dramatic theft in the way people usually imagine. It was slow, quiet, and almost careful in a disturbing way. Because of that, the homeowner didn't notice anything at first. Life continued normally. Days turned into weeks, and nothing seemed out of place. There was no immediate reason to suspect anything unusual was happening inside the house. But slowly, small things began to feel slightly off. It started with little inconsistencies that were easy to dismiss, food that seemed to run out a bit faster than expected, items that didn't feel exactly where they were left, tiny details that could easily be explained away as forgetfulness or normal daily confusion. At first, the homeowner probably did what most people would do in that situation. He ignored it. There are always small gaps in memory during busy life. You think you used something more than you actually did. You assume you misplaced something. Nothing feels serious enough to raise alarm. But over time, the feeling of something not adding up started to grow stronger. It's a very specific kind of discomfort. The kind that doesn't have proof yet, but still sits in the back of your mind. You try to ignore it, but it doesn't fully go away. Eventually, it reached a point where the confusion couldn't be brushed aside anymore. Things were clearly being used or taken, but there was no explanation for it. The homeowner began to wonder if someone else had access to the house, or if there was some kind of mistake happening that he couldn't understand. That uncertainty is often what pushes people to take action. In this case, the homeowner decided to set up a hidden camera inside the house. Not in an obvious way, but carefully placed in a spot that would capture movement while not being noticeable to anyone inside the space. Then came the waiting. There is something deeply uncomfortable about waiting for answers. When you already feel something is wrong, but you don't know what it is, every normal sound in the house starts to feel slightly different. Every small noise becomes something your mind tries to interpret. Even though nothing has been confirmed yet, your thoughts begin to lean toward worst-case possibilities. Days passed like that, with the camera quietly recording everything while the house appeared completely normal from the outside. No signs of anything unusual, just an ordinary home with ordinary silence during the hours when no one was supposed to be there. Until the moment everything changed. When the homeowner finally reviewed the footage, it started exactly as expected. Hours of nothing. Still rooms, empty spaces. The normal quiet rhythm of a house that appears to be alone. You can imagine how boring and uneventful those early parts must have felt while watching back. But he kept watching, because once suspicion exists, it is very hard to stop before getting an answer. Then, somewhere deep into the recording, something shifted. At first, it was barely noticeable. A slight movement in the frame, something that didn't belong in a completely empty house. The kind of detail your brain almost refuses to accept at first because it doesn't fit the expectation of what you are seeing. And then it became clearer. A person, not someone supposed to be there. Not a family member or a guest, just a figure moving carefully inside the house, as if they knew the space well enough to avoid attention. The footage showed them acting as though they belonged there in the most unsettling way possible. And then came the moment that would stay in anyone's mind. The person crawling out of the attic space. It is hard to fully describe what that must feel like to watch. One moment, you are sitting safely in your home, thinking you are alone. The next, you are watching clear proof that someone has been living above you, hidden in the structure of the same house you sleep in every night. And the realization doesn't stay on the screen. It immediately spills into real life. Because the next thought is not just, this happened. The next thought is, this is happening. The idea that while you are watching this video, while you are sitting in your home processing what you are seeing, the person in that footage might still be there, somewhere inside the same building, somewhere close enough that the distance between past footage and present moment suddenly disappears. That kind of realization creates a very specific type of fear. It is not just shock. It is not just surprise. It is a deep, instinctive awareness that your sense of safety has been completely rewritten in seconds. And then comes the second wave of realization, which is even worse in a way. You start thinking back. All the nights you heard a small sound and ignored it. The times you were lying in bed and heard something faint in the walls or above the ceiling. The way you told yourself it was just old pipes expanding, or wood settling, or the natural noises of an old house. All of those explanations suddenly feel different, because now there is a new possibility that changes everything. Those sounds might not have been harmless at all. They might have been someone moving quietly just out of sight, sharing the same space without your knowledge, living in the parts of the house you never think about. The attic, the crawl spaces, the hidden corners that most people never check unless something forces them to. That kind of thought doesn't leave easily. It rewrites your memory of your own home. Places that once felt completely safe suddenly feel uncertain. Familiar sounds take on new meanings. Even silence starts to feel different, as if it might be hiding something instead of just being empty. In the story my coworker shared, this is what made it so disturbing for him. Not just the idea that someone had been inside a home without permission, but the realization of how long it could happen without detection. How easily a space you believe is private can become shared without you ever noticing. The fear is not only about the intruder, it is also about how normal everything looked while it was happening. That is what makes it unsettling. Life continued as usual on the surface, while something completely unexpected existed underneath it. Eventually, in these kinds of real cases, once the discovery is made, things move quickly. Authorities are involved, the situation is investigated, the intruder is removed. And from the outside, it becomes just another case file, another strange incident that people talk about for a short time before moving on. But for the person who lived through it, it doesn't stay as just a story. It becomes a permanent shift in how they see safety, privacy, and home itself. Even after everything is resolved, there is a lingering awareness that spaces you assume are completely private might have hidden layers you never think about. It changes the way silence feels inside a house. It changes how you interpret small sounds at night. It makes you more aware of doors, ceilings, and corners that once felt unimportant. And that is why stories like this stay in people's minds long after they hear them. Not because they are the most dramatic things imaginable, but because they make something familiar suddenly feel unfamiliar. A home is supposed to be the one place where you are completely alone when you close the door. But stories like this quietly challenge that feeling. And once you have heard them, it becomes a little harder to forget just how thin that sense of certainty can sometimes be. That kind of situation really does feel almost unreal when you hear it from someone else. But the strange part is how easily you can imagine it becoming real once you picture the setting properly. A big shared house already has a certain kind of disorder built into it, the sort of place where everyday life never feels perfectly organized and everyone is just trying to manage their own routine in the middle of constant movement. In a house like that, nothing really stays fully controlled. People come and go at different times, things get moved without much notice, and small changes in the environment rarely stand out. A mug left in a different room, a bag of groceries disappearing from the kitchen, a door left slightly open, all of it tends to get mentally filed away as normal noise of shared living. And no one has the full picture at any given time, and that becomes the quiet background of daily life. That's what makes situations like the one you described so unsettling when you really think about them. Not because something dramatic is happening every day, but because the environment itself is loose enough that unusual things can blend in for a while without being questioned. In a house with many residents, it's very easy for responsibility and awareness to become scattered. Everyone assumes someone else understands what's going on. An old house with a neglected basement adds an entirely different layer to that kind of environment. Basements in older properties often become the kind of spaces people avoid thinking about. They turn into storage areas where things are left and forgotten over time. Boxes get stacked, old furniture gets pushed aside, and over the years it stops feeling like a living part of the house and starts feeling more like background space that nobody really checks. In a place like that, it wouldn't even be unusual for the basement to go unvisited for long periods. People might go down there only when they absolutely need something, and even then, they usually don't spend much time paying attention to every corner. The lighting might be poor, the layout messy, and the general feeling of it might make people want to leave quickly. That kind of space naturally becomes invisible in the rhythm of the house. So when you think about how easily attention is divided in a shared home upstairs, and how ignored a basement like that can become, now it starts to make sense why something unusual could remain unnoticed for longer than you would expect. Not because anyone is careless, but because the structure of the environment allows gaps in awareness to exist without anyone realizing it. What makes your coworker's story so disturbing in hindsight is exactly that idea of something existing just outside everyone's awareness. In a house where so many people are living together, there is always a certain assumption that anything unusual would be noticed quickly. But in reality, the opposite can sometimes be true. The more people there are, the more diluted attention becomes. Each person assumes the others are seeing the full picture. That's why small inconsistencies in shared living spaces often don't get followed up on. If something is missing, it's easy to assume someone else moved it. If something looks slightly different, it's easy to dismiss it as a mistake or forgetfulness. Over time, that becomes the normal way of thinking, and the environment trains everyone to not overthink small changes. In that kind of setting, even the idea of someone quietly occupying a hidden part of the house doesn't immediately register as impossible, which is exactly what makes the situation so disturbing to imagine. It's not that people would expect it, but rather that the environment doesn't naturally force people to question it either. The basement in your story becomes the key detail in that sense. A space that is already mentally off the radar is the exact kind of place where something unusual can exist without being immediately challenged. If someone were to spend time there without drawing attention, it wouldn't necessarily create immediate alarm upstairs, especially if the rest of the house is busy and noisy. What also makes shared living complicated is how quickly people normalize minor confusion. In a large house, if someone sees a door slightly open or hears a noise from a distant part of the building, the mind often tries to explain it in the simplest possible way. Wind, another roommate, old house sounds, plumbing. All of these explanations get used automatically because they reduce the need to investigate further. That mental habit of reducing concern is what keeps daily life manageable in such environments. But it also creates blind spots, and blind spots are exactly what allow unusual situations to remain unnoticed longer than they should. So when that moment of discovery happens, it completely breaks that pattern. Finding a hidden setup in a basement that no one expected to be in use doesn't just feel surprising. It feels like the entire understanding of the space shifts instantly. A place that was mentally categorized as empty or irrelevant suddenly becomes active and real in a way that is hard to process in the moment. That kind of realization is not something the mind adjusts to immediately. There is usually a brief delay where what you are seeing doesn't fully match what you believed was possible in that space. It's not just shock. It's a kind of mental correction happening all at once, where the brain is trying to rebuild its understanding of the environment based on new information. The explanation given at the time, that the person was drunk and ended up there accidentally, is the type of answer that tries to reduce complexity in a moment that feels too confusing to explain properly. People often reach for simple explanations when they are caught in situations that don't make sense socially or logically. But when you step back and think about it later, it often doesn't fully align with what was actually observed. That's where the discomfort tends to settle in afterward. Not just from what was found, but from the uncertainty of how long it might have been going on. If a space like that can go unnoticed once, it raises the question of how long it might have existed without anyone realizing anything unusual was happening at all. The involvement of campus authorities or police becomes an important turning point in situations like this, because it restores structure to something that feels completely outside normal expectation. Once official steps are taken, the space is secured again, and the uncertainty begins to reduce. Even if the emotional impact stays, the immediate concern is addressed through proper channels. But even after everything is resolved, stories like this don't really leave people completely. They tend to stay in the back of your mind because they change how you interpret ordinary spaces. A basement, a storage room, an attic, or even a quiet corner of a building no longer feels entirely neutral once you have heard something like this. The idea that unused doesn't always mean empty becomes harder to ignore. And that is probably the part that sticks the most. Not just the event itself, but the realization of how easily shared environments can develop blind spots without anyone intending for it to happen. It doesn't require anything dramatic for that to occur, just routine life continuing as normal, while attention is divided across too many people and too many assumptions. In the end, what stays with you from a story like this is not just the discovery, but the quiet thought that it could have remained unnoticed even longer under slightly different circumstances. And once that idea settles in, it tends to change the way you look at familiar spaces, especially the ones that feel like they belong to no one in particular. I'm really sorry you went through something like that, especially at such a young age. What you described wasn't just one painful moment, but a series of deeply disturbing experiences that unfolded in a short span of time and changed everything very suddenly. When something like that happens early in life, it doesn't get stored in the mind like a normal memory. It sits differently because it doesn't match the way life is usually expected to feel safe, predictable, and steady. A situation that begins as a normal family gathering, something warm and familiar, and then shifts so quickly into loss and shock, can leave a person feeling like reality itself became unstable in that moment. One minute, everything feels ordinary. People are together. There is conversation, routine, comfort. And then suddenly everything breaks apart in a way that no one is prepared for. The mind often struggles to place something like that into a simple before and after, because the change is too extreme and too fast. And then what makes it even heavier is that the event didn't end there. It continued in the aftermath, through injury, confusion, and emotional distress that lasted beyond the initial moment. When someone you care about is suddenly injured and not acting like themselves, it can feel deeply unsettling, especially for a child who is still learning how to understand what safety even means. Seeing someone disoriented, struggling, or mentally not fully present can leave a strong emotional imprint because it doesn't match the image of that person you had before. On top of that, there is also the emotional weight of responsibility that people sometimes carry after accidents like this, even when it isn't accurate. When someone believes they are at fault, even incorrectly, it adds another layer of sadness and confusion for everyone around them. For a young person witnessing that, it can be very difficult to understand why someone would feel that way or what it means. The mind at that age often tries to make sense of things in very direct terms, and situations like this don't offer clear or simple explanations. Finding someone in distress later is another experience that can deeply affect how memories stay in the mind. Moments like that don't register like ordinary events. They often become very sharp in memory, not because a person chooses to hold on to them, nay, but because the brain marks them as important for survival and emotional understanding. Even years later, small details from those moments can feel unusually vivid, as if they are still close in time rather than far in the past. When these kinds of events happen during childhood, the impact is often less about a single moment and more about how the entire experience reshapes the sense of safety. At that age, children are still building basic ideas about how the world works. They are learning what is normal, what is stable, and what can be trusted. When something completely unexpected and tragic happens in a familiar environment, it can interrupt that sense of structure. The world can suddenly feel less predictable, even if everything else in daily life continues normally afterward. It is also very common that adults around the situation may not fully explain what happened at the time. This is usually done with the intention of protecting a child from emotional overload. People often believe that limiting details will reduce fear or confusion, but what can sometimes happen instead is that the child still senses the seriousness of the situation without having enough context to fully understand it. That gap between feeling something deeply and not being able to explain it clearly can itself become a source of lingering confusion. Over time, the mind often tries to fill in those gaps on its own. It may revisit the memory in fragments, pieces of images, emotions, or sensations, without always forming a complete narrative. This is one reason why early traumatic experiences can sometimes feel unfinished in memory, even decades later. They were never fully processed in real time because the emotional intensity was too high at the moment they occurred. What stands out strongly in what you shared is not only the event itself, but the fact that it happened within a family space, a place that is usually associated with comfort and trust. When something serious happens in a setting that is supposed to feel safe, it can create a kind of emotional contradiction. The mind expects safety in those environments, so when danger appears there instead, it can feel especially disorienting. It is also important to understand that memories formed under stress, fear, or shock are stored differently by the brain. They tend to remain more vivid and emotionally charged than everyday memories. This doesn't mean a person is stuck in the past, and it doesn't mean something is wrong with them. It simply reflects how the brain prioritizes events that felt significant or overwhelming at the time. As people grow older, they often revisit these memories from a different perspective. What once felt overwhelming or confusing can sometimes become more understandable intellectually, even if the emotional impression still remains. The adult mind can recognize patterns, context, and causes in a way that a child's mind could not at the time. But even with that understanding, the emotional memory can still feel present in certain moments. It is also very normal for memories like this to surface unexpectedly. Sometimes they appear without warning, triggered by places, conversations, or even completely unrelated experiences that somehow resemble parts of the original event. This doesn't mean the memory is controlling a person's life. It simply reflects how deeply the brain encoded that moment as something important. One of the most important things to recognize is that having these memories does not define who you are now. People who go through early difficult experiences often grow up with a strong awareness of life's fragility, but they also grow in resilience in ways that are not always immediately visible. Many continue their lives, build relationships, and function completely well, even while carrying memories that feel heavy in the background. If a memory like this still returns with emotional intensity, it is a completely understandable response to something that was far beyond what a young mind should have had to process. It doesn't need to be pushed away or forced into silence. Sometimes, just allowing it to be acknowledged in a calm and steady way can reduce some of its emotional weight over time. It can also help to remember that understanding and healing do not always happen in a straight line. People often move back and forth between feeling okay and feeling affected again, especially when memories are tied to strong emotional events. That fluctuation is part of how the mind processes things that were never fully resolved in the moment they happen. Most importantly, none of what happened to you at that time was your responsibility. You were placed in a situation that was far beyond what any child should have been exposed to, and your reaction to it is human. There is no expectation that a young person should have had the tools to fully understand or process something like that in real time. What you carry from that experience is not a flaw in you. It is simply a reflection of something very serious that happened around you at a time when you were still learning how to understand the world. And the fact that you remember it so clearly does not mean it defines your present or your future. It just means it mattered, and it left an impression at a point in life when everything is felt more deeply. If you ever feel like talking about it more or working through how it shows up in your thoughts today, that kind of reflection can sometimes make it feel less heavy over time. What he went through that night was something he didn't fully understand in the moment, not because it was complicated in structure, but because it happened too fast emotionally for his mind to process it clearly. Even later, when he tried to think back on it, it still felt like a mix of fear, confusion, and pressure all happening at the same time, as if the entire experience was compressed into a short span where nothing felt stable or predictable. He had become close to someone who held a lot of influence over his life. On the surface, there were things that looked supportive. There was attention, guidance, protection, and even a sense of security at times. But underneath that, there was also a growing feeling that things were not entirely free or equal. Decisions didn't always feel like choices. Situations didn't always feel like they could be walked away from easily. And slowly, without a clear moment of realization, that imbalance started to weigh on him in ways he couldn't fully explain. It wasn't one single moment that created the tension. It was a build-up of small experiences where he started feeling like his independence was shrinking. There were expectations that came without being clearly stated, and reactions that made him question whether disagreeing or stepping back would cause problems. Over time, that kind of environment can make a person adjust quietly, not out of agreement, but out of caution. That night, everything reached a point where the pressure became impossible to ignore anymore. He remembers being in a situation where the atmosphere itself felt heavy. There were other people around, movement, noise, and conversation. But none of it felt normal in the way social situations usually do. Instead, it felt like he was constantly aware of where everyone was, what was being said, and how the energy in the room was shifting. It wasn't that something obvious had happened yet. It was more like a growing internal alarm that he couldn't switch off. At some point, he made the decision to say it clearly. He wanted out. Not in a dramatic or aggressive way, but in a direct and honest way that expressed he could not continue in the same direction anymore. For him, that moment felt like a release of everything he had been holding inside for a while. But the reaction he received changed everything. The response wasn't simple acceptance. Instead, it came with intensity. Questions followed. The tone shifted. The atmosphere around him changed in a way that immediately made him feel smaller, more exposed, and unsure of what would happen next. It wasn't just disagreement. It felt like pressure closing in from multiple directions at once. At that point, something inside him shifted from emotional discomfort into something closer to fear. The situation moved quickly after that. Plans changed. Movement started. There was a car ride involved, and the entire environment felt different from what a normal ride would feel like. There was conversation, but it didn't feel relaxed. There were pauses that felt too long, silences that carried meaning he couldn't fully interpret, and moments where he felt like he was trying to read the situation, while also trying not to escalate anything further. Inside the car, he became very aware of how limited his control felt. He wasn't sure what would be said next, where things were heading, or how his earlier decision was going to be handled. That uncertainty created a level of anxiety that kept building quietly with every passing minute. At one point, the car slowed and eventually pulled over. That moment became a turning point in his memory. When he was asked again whether he really wanted to leave, it didn't feel like a simple question anymore. It felt heavier than that, like it carried consequences he couldn't clearly see but could strongly sense. In that moment, his emotions became overwhelming. Fear, confusion, and pressure, all mixed together in a way that made it hard to think clearly. He felt trapped in a situation where every possible direction seemed uncertain. Staying felt wrong. Leaving felt dangerous. Speaking felt risky. Staying silent felt impossible. That kind of mental conflict can overwhelm a person completely, and that is exactly what started happening to him. His body reacted before his thoughts could organize themselves. He began to cry, not because of one specific event, but because the emotional weight of everything reached a breaking point. It wasn't just fear of the present moment. It was everything leading up to it, colliding at once. And then something unexpected happened. The person he was dealing with told him to get out of the situation and run. The words were sharp, urgent, and final. There was no explanation, no discussion, no negotiation. Just a direct instruction that cut through everything else happening around him. In that instant, whatever emotional confusion existed was replaced by a different kind of response entirely. Survival instinct. He didn't stop to analyze it. He didn't try to interpret meaning or intention. He just moved. He got out and ran. Even though he wasn't someone used to running long distances or physical strain, his body responded in a way that surprised him later. In high-stress moments like that, the body can push far beyond normal limits. Breathing becomes shallow but fast. Awareness narrows, and everything except movement fades into the background. He ran without looking back, not because he consciously decided every step, but because his mind was fully focused on distance and escape. The world around him felt distant and blurred, like everything outside of his immediate path didn't matter anymore. Eventually, he reached a place that felt safer, a public space where there were lights, people, and movement. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was enough to break the immediate sense of danger he had been carrying. Once he stopped, everything caught up to him at once. His body started shaking, not from cold, but from the sudden release of adrenaline. He felt exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. It was the kind of exhaustion that comes after prolonged fear, where the nervous system finally starts to let go after being in constant alert mode. He became physically sick shortly after, which is something that can happen when the body transitions out of extreme stress. The system that had been keeping him alert and active suddenly dropped, and everything he had been holding in collapsed outward. Emotionally, it hit even harder. There was a moment where he couldn't fully process what had just happened. It didn't feel real in the way normal experiences feel real. Instead, it felt fragmented, like pieces of a memory that didn't fully connect yet. He sat with that feeling for a while, trying to understand how a few hours could shift so drastically from normal interaction to something that felt like escape. At some point afterward, he interacted briefly with a stranger while trying to figure out how to move forward. That interaction felt strange to him, not because of what the person said, but because his mind was still partially stuck in the emotional state of everything that had just happened. When someone is coming down from intense fear, even normal conversations can feel distant or disconnected. Eventually, he managed to arrange transport and physically leave the area. That step marked a transition from immediate survival mode into something more stable, even though emotionally he was still unsettled. Later, when he looked back at everything that had happened, new information about the situation and the people involved reached him over time. Some of it was unsettling, and some of it made him rethink earlier moments. But what he struggled with most was how to separate what he actually experienced in real time from what he learned afterward. Because the human mind naturally tries to connect events into a clear story, it is easy to start linking later knowledge with earlier fear. Sometimes those connections reflect real patterns. Other times, they amplify emotions that were already intense in the moment. For him, it became difficult to fully untangle those layers. What remained clear, though, was how real the experience felt while it was happening. He didn't imagine the pressure he felt in that car. He didn't imagine the emotional intensity that came when he said he wanted to leave. And he didn't imagine the moment when his body reacted with fear and urgency. Those parts were grounded in lived experience, not interpretation. Over time, he came to see that night not as a single dramatic event, but as a sequence of moments where emotional pressure slowly built until it reached a breaking point. Each stage mattered. Each shift in atmosphere contributed to how things unfolded. What stayed with him most was how quickly everything changed. A situation that began with familiarity and connection gradually turned into something he felt he had to escape from. There was no clear warning sign that appeared all at once. Instead, it was a series of small internal signals that only became understandable in hindsight. And even though time moved on, the memory never fully lost its weight. It remained as something he could recall vividly. not because he wanted to, but because the emotional imprint of that night was strong enough to stay. In the end, what defined the experience wasn't just fear itself, but the realization of how quickly a person's sense of safety can shift when control, pressure, and uncertainty begin to overlap in the same moment. Sorry to pause for just a moment. If this is your first time here, welcome. I hope you're enjoying the calm so far. If you'd like more nights like this, true stories, gentle rain, no interruptions, please subscribe to Lacuna Noir. It really helps me keep creating these peaceful experiences for you. And tap the bell so you're here every time a new story arrives in the dark. Now, back to the story. A friend once told me about something he experienced while surfing in Cape Town. And even though it wasn't something that happened directly to him, the story stayed with him in a very real way. Not because he saw it happen, but because of how quickly it made him rethink where he was and how fragile safety can feel when you are far from home. He had been in Cape Town for a while already, spending time around the coast, surfing different spots, and getting used to the rhythm of the place. It was one of those trips where everything feels both exciting and unfamiliar at the same time. The ocean was beautiful, the waves were strong, and the surfing community felt active and alive. On the surface, it all seemed like a normal travel experience, the kind people often describe as unforgettable in a positive way. On one of the days, he went surfing with a friend who had been staying in Cape Town longer than he had. This friend knew the area better, understood the local spots, and was more familiar with how things worked around the beaches and parking areas. They spent the day in the water, focusing on surfing, enjoying the conditions, and doing what surfers usually do when everything feels right, just being present in the moment. After a long session in the ocean, they eventually came out of the water. Like most surfers, they were tired, relaxed, and focused on the simple routine of packing up. Boards, wetsuits, gear, and then the walk back toward the parking area where their car was parked. Nothing about that moment felt unusual. It was the kind of normal transition that happens after every surf session. But while they were getting ready to leave, his friend mentioned something that immediately changed the atmosphere in his mind. He told him about an incident that had happened at that exact same surf spot not long before. It wasn't told as a dramatic warning in the moment, but more like a piece of local knowledge that people sometimes share casually in places where experience matters. Still, the content of the story itself was anything but casual. A surfer had apparently come out of the water at the same beach, walked up to his car, and was approached by someone demanding money. At first, it was treated like a robbery situation. The surfer reportedly said he didn't have any cash on him. The situation then escalated in a different direction, with the attacker forcing him to drive to an ATM to withdraw money instead. Hearing this part alone already made the story feel unsettling, because it shifted from a simple theft into something more controlled and forced. The idea of being made to drive somewhere under threat changes the entire nature of the situation. It removes choice and replaces it with compliance under pressure. But the story didn't stop there. At some point during the incident, according to what he was told, the situation escalated further and turned violent. The surfer attempted to resist, and in that moment, things went badly wrong. The attacker shot him, and the situation became far more serious and irreversible. From that point onward, the story moved into something much darker and harder to process. It involved the victim being moved, other people becoming unknowingly involved, and a series of events that spiraled further out of control. Eventually, it ended in a way that was extremely tragic. The details he heard included further violence and a fatal outcome, along with actions taken afterward that made the entire story feel even more disturbing. But what stayed in his mind was not just the final outcome itself, but the fact that it all began in such a normal setting. A surfer leaving the water and walking to his car. There was no warning sign in the beginning, no obvious danger. Just a routine moment at a beach that looked exactly like any other beach day. What made the story even more unsettling was the idea that the people involved afterward were never clearly accounted for in a way that brought closure. There were mentions of witnesses, statements, and follow-up investigations, but also uncertainty around what happened later and whether everything was ever fully resolved. That lack of clarity added another layer of discomfort to the story because it left unanswered gaps where the mind naturally tries to find closure. When his friend finished telling him this, it wasn't framed as something dramatic. It was more like a reminder of where they were surfing and what kind of place they were in. But the impact it had on him personally was much stronger than expected, because in that moment something shifted in his thinking. Until then, the beach had felt like just another surf location, a place with good waves, good weather, and a strong surfing culture. But after hearing that story, the environment didn't feel the same anymore. The parking area, the walk from the water, even the process of getting out of the ocean and heading back to the car all started to feel more exposed and vulnerable. He became aware of something that many travelers only fully realize after hearing stories like this, that being in a foreign place often comes with a level of unpredictability that is easy to ignore when everything's going smoothly. It wasn't that he suddenly felt unsafe in every direction, but rather that he became aware of how quickly normal situations can turn unfamiliar. One moment you are in the water focusing on waves, and the next moment you are back on land in a completely different environment, where you are no longer as protected or as focused as you were before. What struck him most was how ordinary the beginning of the original incident sounded. A surfer finishing a session, walking to a car, doing something that every surfer does without thinking. It wasn't happening in a hidden place or during a suspicious situation. It was happening in a very normal part of the routine. That realization stayed with him because it challenged a very common assumption people have, that danger always looks obvious. In reality, many situations only reveal their seriousness after they have already begun. After hearing that story, his awareness changed. Not in a paranoid way, but in a more grounded, alert way. He started paying more attention to surroundings when leaving the beach. He noticed who was around, how isolated certain areas felt, and how quickly the environment could shift from open public space to something more quiet and less predictable. He also became more conscious of how vulnerable people are when they are transitioning between environments. The ocean itself felt safe to him because it was open and shared with other surfers. But the space between the ocean and the car felt different. It was a space where people are tired, distracted, and less focused on their surroundings. That in-between space is often where awareness drops, and hearing that story made him realize how important those moments actually are. Another thing that stayed with him was the emotional reaction he had afterward. It wasn't immediate fear or panic. It was more of a slow, growing awareness that he was far from home, in a place he didn't fully understand yet, and that his sense of safety depended on many invisible factors: location, timing, awareness, and sometimes just luck. That thought can be uncomfortable, but it is also part of traveling. When you are far from your usual environment, you rely more heavily on reading situations in real time because you don't have the same familiarity or support systems that you would at home. He also started thinking differently about trust, not in a suspicious way toward everyone, but in the sense that he became more careful about how quickly he assumed safety based on appearance alone. A place can feel relaxed, social, and open, while still having risks that are not immediately visible. As time passed, the intensity of the story faded, but the awareness it created didn't disappear. It stayed with him quietly in the background whenever he was in similar environments, especially in places where people come and go, where tourists mix with locals, and where routines can shift depending on time of day and crowd density. What made the story stick in his mind wasn't just what allegedly happened, but what it represented. How quickly a normal, everyday moment can turn into something entirely different without warning. That idea is difficult to fully unlearn once you have been exposed to it. At the same time, he also understood something important. Most days don't end that way. Most surf sessions, most walks back to the car, most travel experiences are completely normal. But awareness is not about expecting the worst. It's about recognizing that while most things are fine, situations can change faster than we assume. Looking back, he often describes that moment as a shift in perception rather than a moment of fear. It didn't stop him from surfing or enjoying the place, but it did change how present he became in certain situations. He paid more attention, moved with more awareness, and carried a quieter understanding of his surroundings. And in the end, that was the lasting effect of hearing that story. Not fear, but awareness. A reminder that safety often feels invisible when everything is going well, and that sometimes it takes hearing a story from someone else to realize how quickly that sense of normality can change without any warning at all. When I think back to my childhood, a lot of normal memories come to mind first. Open land stretching out in every direction, quiet nights where you could hear almost nothing, and that slow, steady feeling that life didn't move as fast as it did in bigger places. We lived on a large piece of land, far enough from other houses that you couldn't just look out a window and see your neighbors. The road outside our place didn't get much traffic either, especially after the sun went down. Most nights felt calm, almost too calm, and the kind of silence you don't notice until something interrupts it. That night started like any other long day. I don't remember exactly where we had gone, just that it had been a while and we were heading home late. I was a kid, so I was half asleep in the back seat, drifting in and out without really paying attention. The car moved steadily through the darkness, the headlights cutting a narrow path ahead, while everything else stayed hidden. It was that kind of deep night where you can't see beyond what the lights show you, and everything outside of that feels distant and unknown. As we turned onto the road that led to our property, something felt a little different. Not enough to make anyone panic, just enough to catch attention. There was a car pulled over on the side of the road, right near the ditch that ran along the edge of our land. That ditch was something we all knew well. It stretched along the roadside, deep in some places, uneven in others, and at night it was hard to see into it clearly unless you got close. The car didn't look like it had crashed. It wasn't damaged in any obvious way. It was just sitting there, slightly off to the side, like whoever had been driving had stopped suddenly or without much thought. The angle of it didn't look right, but it also didn't look like a normal roadside stop. As we drove past, the headlights briefly lit up the scene. That's when we saw them. Two people. One was standing closer to the road, almost frozen in place for a second, while the other was climbing up out of the ditch. It was a strange thing to see, especially that late at night. There was something about the way they moved that didn't feel normal. It wasn't like someone fixing a tire or checking under the hood. There was no sense of routine in it. It just felt off. Even as a kid, still half asleep, I remember that feeling. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. Like seeing something that doesn't fit into the normal pattern of things. We didn't stop. We just kept driving. Within seconds, the scene disappeared behind us, swallowed again by the darkness. We pulled into our driveway, the gravel crunching under the tires, the house coming into view the way it always did. Normally, that moment meant everything was fine again. Home meant safety, routine, familiarity. But this time, that image of the two people by the ditch didn't leave as quickly as it usually would have. After we parked, my mom spoke up. She said my dad should go back and check on them. That was just who she was. If someone might need help, you stop and help. It didn't matter if it was late or inconvenient. If there was even a small chance that someone was in trouble, she believed you should do something about it. For a moment, it seemed like that's exactly what was going to happen. But my dad hesitated. He had seen the same thing we had, but whatever he felt about it was stronger. He said they looked fine, that it didn't seem like an emergency. He didn't say it in a careless way. It was more like something inside him was telling him not to go back. He couldn't explain it. He just knew. There was a short pause where the decision could have gone either way. One more push, one more sentence, and maybe he would have turned the car around and driven back. But he didn't. Instead, he shook his head and said it was better to leave it. We went inside like we always did. The house felt warm and familiar, the kind of place where you don't question your safety. Lights came on, doors closed, and everything seemed normal again on the surface. But something about that moment stayed in the back of our minds. Still, it was late, and eventually we all went to bed. Whatever we had seen out there started to fade, like something strange but unimportant that you'd forget by morning. Except we didn't forget. Because the next morning was nothing like a normal morning. I remember waking up, but not to the usual sounds. It wasn't quiet, but it wasn't the normal kind of noise either. There were voices outside, movement, something different enough to pull me fully awake. When I looked out the window, the first thing I saw was the police. There were several of them spread out across our yard. Some were walking slowly, looking at the ground, while others were putting up tape along the edges of the property. Bright strips cutting across places that had always just been part of our everyday life. It didn't make sense. Seeing something like that in your own yard feels unreal, like you're looking at something that doesn't belong there. The calm, open space we were used to suddenly felt tense, like it wasn't ours anymore. We didn't know what was going on yet. No one had told us anything. But it was clear that something serious had happened. Something big enough to bring police out that early in the morning and block off parts of our land. Then, slowly, pieces of the story started to come together. Earlier that morning, some horseback riders had been passing along the road. That wasn't unusual in our area. People rode horses along those roads all the time. It was just part of life out there. As they passed near the ditch, the same one we had seen the night before, something caught their attention. At first, it might not have looked like anything important. Just something lying near the edge. Maybe caught in the grass or pushed up against the side. A black plastic bag. But then they looked closer, and they saw something that didn't belong. A leg, sticking out, not moving, not hidden enough to miss once you saw it. That's when everything changed. The police were called, and from that point on, the quiet road we had driven down the night before became something else entirely. A crime scene. A place where something terrible had happened. something far worse than anything we had imagined when we passed by. That car we saw, those two people, the one standing near the road, the one climbing out of the ditch, it all suddenly meant something different. They hadn't just been stopped for a simple reason. They hadn't been dealing with a small problem. They had been doing something they didn't want anyone to see. I remember looking at my mom when we realized what had been found. Her face changed in a way I had never seen before. It wasn't just shock. It was the kind of realization that hits you all at once when you understand how close you were to something dangerous. Because she had wanted my dad to go back. If he had listened. If he had turned the car around and driven back to that spot in the middle of the night. There's a very real chance things would have ended differently. That thought settled over all of us in a way that didn't go away. As more details came out, it became clear that whatever had happened out there wasn't something anyone should have walked into. Whoever those people were, they were involved in something serious, something violent enough to leave a body hidden in a ditch in the dark. My dad had trusted his instincts. A simple decision, made in a few seconds, without any clear reason he could explain. And that decision might have saved his life. As a kid, I didn't fully understand how close we had been to something bad. It just felt like a scary story that had happened near our home. Something unusual, something that made the world feel a little less safe than it had before. But as I got older, that understanding changed. I started to see it differently. We hadn't just passed by something strange. We had passed by something dangerous. We had seen the people involved, and we had almost stepped into a situation we wouldn't have been able to handle. That's the part that stays with me. How normal everything felt just moments before. How easily things could have gone another way. How a single choice, made without any real explanation, can change everything. Even now, I still think about that night sometimes. The dark road stretching ahead, the car sitting at the edge, the two figures moving in a way that didn't feel right, and the quiet decision that kept my dad from going back, from walking straight into something he might not have survived. My mom told me this story in a very calm, almost casual way. Like it was just something that happened a long time ago and didn't really matter anymore. But every time I hear it, it leaves this strange feeling behind. The kind that lingers longer than it should. This all happened back in the late 70s, during her first semester of college. She had just started adjusting to a new environment. New people, new routines. Everything was still fresh and unfamiliar, but also a little exciting in the way college usually is when you're young. One of her classes that semester was chemistry. And like a lot of lab courses, students were paired up with partners. That's where she met him. At first, there was nothing unusual about it. She described him as quiet, a bit reserved, but friendly enough. He wasn't loud or strange or anything that would immediately stand out. In fact, she admitted that she actually thought he was kind of cute. Not in a strong emotional way, just the kind of small thought you might have about someone you see regularly. They worked together in class, talked during labs, helped each other with assignments. It was normal, everyday interaction. My mom said that if he had asked her out back then, she probably would have said yes. She was shy, though, and he never made a move, so things just stayed where they were. Outside of that class, their lives didn't overlap much. They were in different majors, had different schedules, different groups of friends. At least, that's what she thought. As the semester went on, she started noticing something that didn't quite make sense. It wasn't obvious at first. Just small things. She would leave one class and see him nearby. Then another day, she would be heading to the library. And there he was again, standing around, not always talking, just there. At first, it didn't feel threatening, more confusing than anything else. It's a big campus, and people run into each other sometimes. It could have been coincidence. But then it kept happening. He was outside her other classes, even the ones they didn't share. He showed up near the student union. He was there near the entrance where her dad would pick her up and drop her off. Not always close, not always approaching her directly, but close enough that she started noticing a pattern. It continued into the next semester. By that point, it wasn't just a coincidence anymore. There was something deliberate about it. Still, she wasn't fully alarmed yet. More puzzled than afraid. She couldn't understand how he always seemed to know exactly where she would be. So one day she asked him, just casually, like it was a simple question, "How do you always seem to know where I am?" And the way he answered is what changed everything. He didn't hesitate. He didn't seem embarrassed or like he was doing something wrong. He just said it openly, almost proudly. "Oh, I asked the registrar's office for a copy of your schedule." That was the moment it shifted. Up until then, it had felt strange but explainable. After that, it felt wrong. There was something unsettling about how easily he said it, like it was completely normal to get someone's private schedule and follow them around based on it. My mom went to the registrar's office and complained. She found the secretary who had given out her information and tried to explain that this wasn't okay, that someone was using her schedule to track her movements. But the response she got was almost worse than what had already happened. The secretary brushed it off. She told my mom that it wasn't a big deal because you guys are dating. That was it. No concern, no apology, no attempt to fix the situation. Just a complete dismissal based on an assumption that wasn't even true. Looking back now, it's hard to believe something like that could happen so easily. But at the time, there wasn't much awareness around stalking or personal boundaries in that sense. People didn't recognize the signs the way they do now. Luckily, my mom had already made plans to transfer to a different school for her second year. So for the rest of that semester, she kept her distance. She avoided him as much as possible, changed her routines when she could, and just tried to get through it. Eventually, she left that school, and she never saw him again. At least, that's what she thought. Years later, when she was in grad school, life had moved on. She had a job, new routines, a different environment entirely. That part of her life was behind her, or so it seemed. One day, while she was at work, my grandmother was at home when there was a knock on the door. When she opened it, she saw a man standing there in a naval uniform. He looked serious, maybe even a little sad. Because my grandmother had been a Navy nurse, she felt a kind of immediate trust seeing someone in uniform. It felt familiar to her. So she let him in. The man sat down and began to explain why he was there. He spoke in a respectful, almost somber tone. He said he was sorry for my mother's loss. That confused my grandmother right away. What loss? Then he explained further. He had just returned from overseas and had recently learned that a close friend of his had died. According to him, this friend had spoken often about his fiancée, about how much he loved her. And that fiancée, he said, was my grandmother's daughter. My grandmother immediately knew something wasn't right. She told him plainly that her daughter didn't have a boyfriend, let alone a fiancé. There had to be some kind of mistake. But as they talked more, the truth slowly came together. The man who had died was the same person my mom had known from her chemistry class, the same one who had followed her, the same one who had gotten her schedule and tracked her movements, except in his version of reality, they hadn't just been lab partners. They had been engaged. That realization must have been chilling in a way that's hard to describe. The naval officer himself was clearly shaken when he understood the truth. Whatever story his friend had told him, he had believed it completely. And now he was realizing that it wasn't real. My grandmother, on the other hand, was horrified. She ended the conversation as quickly as she could and asked him to leave before my mom came home. There was no point in letting that situation go any further. But even after that, there was still one more detail that made the whole story even stranger. The man's death had been ruled a suicide. But the way it happened didn't quite make sense. He had been found hanging from a tree branch that was unusually high enough that it would have been difficult to reach without some kind of ladder or assistance. And even more unsettling, his hands had been tied behind his back. Those details didn't line up in a simple way. From what my mom later heard, he had a reputation for getting into other people's business, for snooping around where he wasn't welcome. Combined with everything else, it left a lot of unanswered questions about what might have really happened. But there were never any clear answers. Whenever my mom tells this story, she doesn't dwell on it. She usually ends it with a simple comment about how things were different back then, how people didn't really understand stalking the way they do now, and how awareness has improved over time. She says it in a calm, almost detached way. But for me, it's always been deeply unsettling. Because when you think about it, it could have gone in a very different direction. If she hadn't transferred schools, if she hadn't kept her distance, if he had taken things further, it's hard not to wonder what might have happened. There's something especially disturbing about the way he saw the situation. Not just that he followed her, but that in his mind, they had a completely different relationship. Something that never existed outside of his own thoughts. That kind of disconnect from reality is what makes it feel so unsettling. And even though the story ends without anything directly happening to her, it doesn't really feel like a clean ending. It just stops, with questions that never got answered, and the quiet realization that sometimes the most disturbing things are the ones that almost happened, but didn't. My dad told me this story in a way that always felt simple on the surface, but the more you sit with it, the more it starts to feel wrong in a quiet, unsettling way. It wasn't dramatic when he told it. He never tried to make it sound bigger than it was. If anything, he would say it like it was just something that happened, something he never fully understood, but also never forgot. And maybe that's exactly why it stayed with me the way it did. It happened when he was younger, back when hunting was a normal part of life for him. He would go out into the forest with his dog, usually early in the morning or late in the evening. He knew those woods well, or at least he thought he did. It was the kind of place where you learn the layout without even thinking about it. The paths, the clearings, and the areas where the trees grow thicker and block out most of the light. Over time, it becomes familiar, almost predictable. But that night didn't feel like the others. He had gone out later than usual. It was already dark by the time he got deeper into the forest, the kind of darkness where the sky disappears behind the trees and everything blends together. Even with a light, you can only see so far. Beyond that, it's just shadows and shapes that don't quite make sense unless you stare at them long enough. His dog was with him, as always. That dog had been trained well. It wasn't the kind to get scared easily or react without reason. If anything, it was calm and focused, the way a hunting dog is supposed to be. That's why what happened next stood out so much. At some point, as he was moving through the forest, he noticed something ahead, a shape that didn't belong there. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, something created by the way the shadows were falling between the trees. But as he got closer, it became clearer. It was a small house, not a big one, not anything impressive. Just a simple structure, sitting there in the middle of the forest, where he had never seen anything like that before. It wasn't completely broken down either. It looked there. Solid enough to be real, but at the same time, something about it didn't sit right. He slowed down without really thinking about it. His dog stopped. That's when things shifted. The dog started barking. Not the normal kind of bark it would give when it picked up a scent or noticed movement. This was different. Sharper, more urgent. The kind of bark that sounds like a warning more than anything else. It didn't want to go any closer. No matter how much my dad tried to move forward, the dog resisted. It stayed in place, barking, tense in a way that didn't match anything he had seen from it before. It wasn't just cautious. It was afraid. That alone was enough to make him pause. But he kept looking at the house. There was something else there. Near the side of the house, there was a pole. A simple wooden pole with a wire stretched from it to the structure. At first, it didn't seem important, just something ordinary. But then he noticed what was hanging from it. 2 bed sheets. Green. That detail stuck with him more than anything else. He said it was strange because back then, in his country, that kind of thing wasn't common. Not just the color, but the material. The way they looked. Clean. Almost too clean for a place like that. It gave the impression that someone was using them. That someone was living there. But the whole scene didn't feel lived in. There was no movement. No light coming from inside the house. No sound other than his dog barking and the quiet of the forest around them. Just that stillness. My dad stood there for a while, trying to decide what to do. Part of him was curious. It's natural to want to understand something like that, especially when it appears somewhere you know so well. But another part of him felt like it wasn't right to go any closer. If someone was living there, he didn't want to disturb them. And with his dog acting the way it was, it didn't feel like a good idea anyway. So he made a decision. He didn't go any further. He turned around and left. The dog calmed down as they moved away, but not completely. It kept looking back. Its body still tense, like it wasn't fully convinced they were safe yet. My dad didn't say much about it at the time. He just went home, trying to make sense of what he had seen. That night stayed with him, though. The next morning, he decided to ask someone about it. His grandmother lived nearby, someone who had been in that area for a long time. If there was a house out there, she would know about it. So he asked her. He described the place, the location, the house, the pole, the green bed sheets. She listened. And then she told him something that didn't make any sense. There was no house there. No one lived in that part of the forest. In fact, she said people avoided that area completely. It wasn't just that it was empty. It was known. Known in the quiet way that certain places are known, without people needing to explain too much. She told him it was believed to be cursed. Not in a dramatic way, not like a story meant to scare children. Just something people accepted. Something they didn't question too much, but respected enough to stay away from. Then she told him why. A long time ago, a man had gone into that part of the forest. He had fallen asleep there. And when he woke up, something was wrong. She didn't go into a lot of detail, but The way my dad described it, the man wasn't the same anymore. His body had changed in a way that didn't make sense. Crooked, twisted, like something had been done to him while he slept. He survived, but he was never normal again. That was enough for people. After that, they stayed away. My dad didn't know what to think. Part of him wanted to believe there was a simple explanation. Maybe the house belonged to someone who had built it recently. Maybe his grandmother just didn't know about it, but the way she said it, the certainty in her voice, made it hard to ignore. So he decided to go back, but this time during the day. He waited until the sun was up, until the forest looked like it always did. Familiar, open, nothing hidden by darkness. He took the same path, moving toward the place where he had seen the house the night before. Step by step, everything looked normal. The same trees, the same ground, the same quiet. He kept going until he reached the spot, or at least the spot where he thought it should be. And there was nothing there. No house, no pole, no wire, no green bed sheets. Just the forest. Empty, still exactly the way it had always been. He walked around for a while, trying to find any sign that something had been there, any trace at all. But there was nothing. No marks on the ground, no broken branches, nothing that suggested a structure had existed there, even temporarily. It was like it had never been there at all. That's the part that stayed with him the most. Not just that he saw something strange, but that there was no evidence of it afterward. No way to explain it in a way that made sense. He never went back to that area again. Even when he hunted in the forest after that, he avoided that part without really thinking about it. It wasn't a decision he made consciously every time. It just felt easier to stay away. And every now and then, when he told the story, he would pause at certain parts. Not like he was trying to build suspense, but like he was remembering how it felt in the moment. The way the dog refused to move. The way the house just sat there, quiet and still. The green bed sheets hanging in the dark, not moving at all. And then the emptiness the next day. I've thought about that story a lot over the years, because it's not loud or dramatic in the way people expect scary stories to be. There's no clear explanation, no final moment where everything makes sense. Just something that appeared where it shouldn't have been, and then disappeared without leaving anything behind. And sometimes that kind of story stays with you longer than anything else, because there's nothing to hold on to, just the feeling that something was there, and the understanding that it might still be. It's one of those things that stays with you in a quiet way, never fully leaving, never fully settling. Not because something terrible actually happened in the end, but because of how close it felt to becoming something much worse. It's the kind of memory that doesn't hit all at once. It sits in the background, slowly shaping the way you think, the way you react, and the way you see even the safest places. I live on a dead-end street. It's the kind of place most people would describe as peaceful. There's no through traffic, no constant noise, no strangers passing by for no reason. The only cars you see are the ones that belong there, or someone who clearly knows someone who lives there. Over time, you start to trust that kind of environment. You let your guard down without even realizing it. You begin to believe that nothing out of the ordinary really happens in places like that. That day started like any other. It was quiet, calm, and completely normal. I was at home, going about my routine, cleaning and moving from one room to another, My older daughter was at school, so it was just me and my younger one in the house. There was nothing unusual about it. The kind of day where everything feels predictable, where your mind drifts in and out of what you're doing because there's nothing demanding your full attention. At some point, I heard my younger daughter talking. At first, it didn't stand out. Kids talk all the time. They talk to themselves, to their toys, to imaginary friends that feel real to them. It's something you get used to. You hear it in the background and don't think much of it. But something about the way she was talking made me pause. I couldn't explain it right away. It was just a feeling, a small shift in tone, in rhythm, something that didn't quite match the usual kind of playful talking I was used to hearing from her. So I stopped what I was doing and listened more carefully. The more I paid attention, the more it started to feel different. There were pauses in her voice. Not random pauses, but the kind that happen when someone is listening to another person speak. It sounded like she was waiting for responses, like she wasn't alone in that conversation. And that's when something inside me changed. We were alone in the house, at least we were supposed to be. I stood still for a moment, trying to make sense of it without jumping to conclusions. Maybe she was pretending. Maybe I was overthinking something simple. But the feeling didn't go away. It got stronger the longer I stood there listening. So I started walking toward her room. At first, I moved slowly, almost carefully, like I didn't want to disturb whatever was happening before I understood it. But as I got closer, my pace picked up without me even realizing it. My mind kept trying to come up with a normal explanation, something that would make everything feel okay again. But the closer I got, the harder it was to ignore that quiet sense that something wasn't right. When I reached her doorway and looked inside, I saw her standing near the window. She was facing outside, talking, and standing on the street, just beyond the glass, was a man. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. He was just standing there, like he belonged, like it was completely normal for him to be there, talking to a child through a window. There was nothing rushed or obvious in his movements, no signs of panic or urgency. It was calm, casual, and that made it feel even more wrong. My mind took a second to catch up with what I was seeing. Then everything hit at once. I moved quickly toward the window, my heart already racing, and the man looked up. The second our eyes met, something shifted in his expression. It wasn't panic exactly, but there was recognition. He knew he had been seen, not just by a child, but by someone who understood that this wasn't normal. I didn't stop to think. I turned and ran out of the house, focused only on reaching him before he could leave. My thoughts were clear in that moment. I needed to get to him. I needed to stop him. Whatever this was, it needed to end right there. But by the time I made it outside, he was gone. The street was empty, completely silent, like nothing had ever been there in the first place. No footsteps, no car doors, no sound of movement. It was as if he had disappeared in the few seconds it took me to reach the door and step outside. I stood there for a moment, trying to understand how that was even possible. I looked up and down the street, expecting to see him turning a corner, walking away, anything. But there was nothing. Just the same quiet street I had always known. I went back inside, my thoughts moving too fast to settle on anything. Questions kept coming, one after another. How long had he been there? Had he been watching the house before that? Did he know my daughter was alone in that room? None of it felt random, even if I couldn't prove it. I stayed close to my daughter after that. I asked her what he had said, how long they had been talking, what the conversation was about. But she didn't see anything wrong with it. To her, it had just been a normal interaction. Someone talking, Being friendly, nothing more. That part stayed with me. Because it meant he knew how to approach her. He knew how to make it feel safe, how to make it seem normal enough that she wouldn't question it. That understanding felt more disturbing than anything else. After that day, something shifted inside me. The street didn't feel the same anymore. The quiet that once felt comforting now felt empty in a different way, like something could happen there without anyone noticing. I started paying attention to things I had never thought about before. Small sounds, unfamiliar movements, anything that didn't fit the usual pattern. Weeks passed. Nothing else happened. Or at least that's what I believed at the time. Then one day, my older daughter was outside riding her bike. It was something she had done many times before. The same street, the same routine, the same sense of safety we had always trusted. I was inside, going about my day, not thinking much of it. Then she came rushing in, crying, panicking in a way that made it clear something was wrong. I went to her immediately, trying to calm her down enough to understand what had happened. It took a moment for her to catch her breath, but when she finally spoke, the words came out in pieces. She said an older man had tried to talk to her. The moment she said that, something inside me dropped. I asked her to describe him, and as she did, every detail matched what I had seen before. The way he looked, the way he stood, the way he spoke. It was the same man. There was no doubt about it, and that realization changed everything, because it meant he hadn't just been passing through. He had come back. He knew the street, knew the area, and felt comfortable enough to return. That made it something else entirely, something more deliberate, more intentional. I reported everything, every detail I could remember. What I saw, what both of my daughters experienced, where it happened, how he looked. I gave them everything, hoping it would lead to something, hoping it would stop him from doing this again. But after that, there was nothing. No updates, no answers, just silence. And that silence is what stays with me the most, because not knowing is harder than anything else. You don't know if he stopped. You don't know if he moved on to another place, another street, another family. You don't know if he's still nearby, watching, waiting for another moment when no one is paying attention. Since then, things have changed in ways that are small but constant. The way I look at the street, the way I listen when the house is quiet, the way I think before letting my kids play outside, even in a place that once felt completely safe. It's not something loud or obvious. It's just there, always in the background. And the part that stays with me the most isn't what actually happened. It's how close it felt, how easily something worse could have happened. That's what doesn't go away. Not the moment itself, but the space around it. The understanding that sometimes nothing happens. And that's the only reason everything's still okay. It's one of those memories that never really fades, no matter how much time passes. It doesn't come back in pieces or feel distant. It comes back clearly, almost exactly as it happened, like something your mind decided was too important to let go of. It wasn't a long moment in the grand scheme of things, but it carried a weight that stayed with me in a way I didn't understand back then. I was 9 years old at the time, old enough to have my own routine and feel a small sense of independence, but still young enough to believe that the world around me was mostly safe, especially the places I knew well. There was a comfort in familiarity, in doing the same things every day without thinking too much about them. After school, I would get off the bus and walk home like I always did. The timing was predictable. For about an hour, the house would be empty before my parents came back from work. It had never felt strange or scary. It was just part of my day. I would walk in, drop my bag somewhere near the door, maybe grab a quick snack, and then head outside. Behind our house was a large pasture that stretched out farther than it looked at first glance. It covered a few acres, open land with patches of grass that grew unevenly, along with areas where bushes and brush had slowly taken over. It wasn't perfectly maintained, but that's what made it feel natural. Quiet, still, and familiar in a way that felt comforting. I had a pony out there, and visiting it was something I looked forward to every single day. It gave me a reason to go outside, to move around, and to feel like I had something that belonged to me. At that age, small routines like that meant a lot. That day didn't feel different at first. Everything followed the same pattern. I got off the bus, walked into the house, dropped my things, and stepped back outside without really thinking. The air felt normal, not too cold, not too warm. Just a typical spring afternoon. The kind of quiet that comes with open land, where you don't hear much beyond the occasional movement of grass or the distant sound of something you don't pay attention to. I started walking toward the back of the pasture, heading in the direction where my pony usually stayed. My mind wasn't focused on anything serious, just simple thoughts, the kind that passed through your head without leaving much of an impression. Then something caught my attention. It was small at first, just a slight movement near the fence line where the brush had grown thicker. It wasn't the kind of thing that would normally make you stop. It could have been an animal, the wind, or nothing at all. Something easy to ignore. But for some reason, I didn't ignore it. I looked again, and that's when I saw him. He was standing just across the fence, partially hidden by the brush, not moving, not shifting, just standing there. A man, completely still, facing in my direction. There was something about the way he stood that didn't feel right. It wasn't just that he was there, because people can pass through places like that sometimes. It was how still he was, how focused his attention seemed to be. Like he had already been there for a while before I noticed him. What stood out even more was what he was wearing. It wasn't winter. It was spring. The weather was mild, comfortable. Nothing that required heavy clothing. But he was wearing a thick winter coat, the kind you would expect to see in freezing temperatures. It didn't match the season at all. It made him look out of place in a way that was hard to ignore. For a moment, I just stood there. I didn't move. I didn't say anything. My mind was trying to understand what I was seeing, trying to make it fit into something normal. But it didn't fit. He didn't wave. He didn't speak. He just watched. Then he started moving. It wasn't fast at first, just a steady step forward. But that was enough. In that instant, everything shifted. Whatever confusion I had was gone, replaced by something much clearer and stronger. Fear, immediate and undeniable. The kind that doesn't need to be explained. The kind your body reacts to before your mind can catch up. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop to think. I just ran as fast as I could, straight across the pasture, toward the house. The distance felt longer than it ever had before, like the ground itself was stretching out to slow me down. My heart was pounding so hard, I could feel it in my chest, in my throat, in every step I took. All I could think about was getting inside. When I reached the house, I rushed in and locked the door immediately. My hands were shaking so much it was hard to do something that simple. I remember checking the lock more than once, just to make sure it was secure. The silence inside felt different now. Not calm, not safe, just quiet in a way that made every small sound stand out. I grabbed the phone and called my mom. I don't remember the exact words I used, but I remember how I sounded. Panicked, rushed, trying to explain something that I didn't fully understand myself. I told her there was a man outside near the pasture, that he had been watching me and then started walking toward me. She didn't hesitate. Her voice changed immediately. She told me to stay inside, lock everything, and not go near the windows. At the same time, she called the police. Then came the waiting. Those moments stretched out in a way that felt unnatural. Time slowed down, or at least it felt like it did. Every second felt longer than it should have been. I kept listening for any sound outside, any sign that he might be near the house. Then my dad called. He was already on his way home. My mom must have told him what was happening. His voice was focused, direct. The first thing he asked was what the man looked like. I tried to describe him as clearly as I could. The heavy coat, the way he stood, where he had been. I remember struggling to find the right words, wanting to make sure he understood exactly who I had seen. There was a pause. Then he said something that stayed with me. "He's walking down the road. I've got to go." And just like that, the call ended. At the time, I didn't fully understand what that meant. I just knew he had seen him. Somehow, the man I had run from was now somewhere my dad could reach. Later, I found out what happened next. My dad had spotted him walking along the road not far from our house. There was no hesitation in what he did. No waiting for the police to arrive. No second guessing. He stopped his car and went straight toward him. What followed wasn't calm or controlled. It was immediate, driven by something deeper than thought. Anger, protective instinct, something that doesn't pause to consider anything beyond the moment. He confronted the man and then attacked him. It wasn't something small or brief. It was intense enough that the man couldn't leave, couldn't just walk away like nothing had happened. By the time the police arrived, the situation was already contained. They took the man into custody. And that was the end of it, at least from what I was told. No one ever explained fully why he had been there. I don't know if he had been watching the house before that day. I don't know if he knew my routine, if he had seen me come home alone before, or if it was something random that just happened at the worst possible moment. I don't know what he wanted, and that's the part that stays with me, because when I think back on it, it wasn't just what happened. It was what could have happened. If I hadn't looked up at that moment, if I had ignored that small movement in the brush, I might have kept walking. I might have gone closer without realizing anything was wrong. That thought doesn't fade easily. Even now, after all these years, what stays with me the most isn't the running or the panic. It's that first moment, standing there in the quiet, seeing him, and realizing all at once that something wasn't right. And then the second that followed, the one where he started moving toward me. That's the moment everything changed. Look, if you're still watching, you already know what this channel is. No jump scares, no fake drama, just real stories about real people who survived things most of us can't even imagine. And that's scarier than any movie could ever be. If you want more of this raw, unfiltered truth, told the way it deserves to be told, subscribe to Lacuna Noir. We're not here to waste your time. We're here to tell the stories that actually matter. Thanks for listening. Now go get some sleep, if you can.